Hello and welcome. The goal of this podcast is to get listeners connected with others in the sports industry because they say it's all about who you know, and now you know us. All right, hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Constant Sports Podcast. We have a fun, exciting guest today joining us, and it is Brian Goldmark. How's it going, Brian?
Going well, Connor. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. And similar, I guess, industries. Brian works as national sales and brand partnership for Locked On Podcast Network, and he's got a plethora of other jobs and career arc that we might chit chat about ahead today. But we're going to talk about kind of the strategic themes around kind of the evolution of sports media, the partnerships, the sales aspect of it, advertising, and all things kind of locked on as well, possibly as well. So we're looking forward to getting into it. And Brian, really just to kind of get the ball rolling, as far as kind of social media goes and the evolution of social media with, I feel like, the increase in podcasts. I'm sure there's numbers out that have just skyrocketed podcasts, and athletes have a podcast, and it feels like everyone's got one. So what's kind of the role that social media has played in building these kind of new platforms up and the evolution of it, kind of making this the industry that it is?
Yeah, I mean, social media is becoming more and more important, at least in the podcast space and broadly. I mean, the first thing I think of actually when you bring up social media and sports media monetization is kind of the direction that athletes and podcasters are kind of going and leveraging social media to build out kind of full funnel media companies, right? Jake Paul, I think, is a really unique example of what he did with Mike Tyson, right? They leveraged social media and cultural relevance to create one of the biggest live stream events on Netflix, which in its own right is a unique evolution in sports media distribution and monetization. They had 65 million viewers and the largest ticket sales events for a boxing event, $18 million in event sales. So I think that's just like one way that social media is playing into the sports landscape. You look at, New Heights and Pat McAfee and, how Brady, beyond his career as an athlete, what athletes, podcasters, and smaller to larger media networks are doing on social media to drive engagement, but then also build reach, awareness, and activation. Locked On actually launched one of our first large-scale social campaigns yesterday around the NFL draft, or around the NFL schedule release, with our partner Game Time, and their needs to kind of activate around those moments in sports to drive sales and drive brand engagement. So it's playing a critical role. Social's been around for a while.
Yeah.
But it's really starting to evolve into what we do in the day-to-day, and I think how it influences sports media and monetization.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great thoughts, and it kind of leads us perfectly kind of into the kind of what's next for podcasting. Like you mentioned, the New Heights podcast. Paul George got a podcast, Carmelo Anthony. So a lot of these athletes are seeing there's kind of the media side to it and the business side of it that they can start funneling things into. They're selling their merch, they're selling courses, whatever it is, right? So are we kind of tapped out in the podcast industry? Where do you see it going, growing, things like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I mean, it's one that, a company like Locked On has been looking in the mirror on as well. Locked On has certainly evolved beyond just a sports podcast network. Our adaptations into YouTube, social, OTT, fast TV, even now linear TV. I think that this is the future of podcasting, right? Is that podcasters need to evolve into these full functioning media brands. What Pat McAfee did is like a really great example of, it started as just Pat McAfee show, the podcast, and now it's on TV, his social media presence. I mean, that is a full scoped media network around Pat McAfee, and that's what Locked On is doing as well. And I think that that's what a lot of podcasters are going to need to do to stay ahead of the curve. I think what's really interesting and kind of unique is the full circle in that a network like Locked On was actually acquired by a legacy TV company, TEGNA.
Yeah.
And so you think about like the full circle of broadcast rights and sports media ownership and monetization, and how it, since the 50s, it was owned by that distribution was
Yeah.
owned by legacy media. And then all the fragmentation that's come into place over the last 15 years with other networks with different consumption across YouTube and social, and how Locked On has built itself out in a way to meet the fan in the way that they want to connect with us. That to then be acquired by a legacy TV network and kind of have that brought back into the fold of their local sports monetization strategy, I think is just kind of wild to see that full circle, come into play. And, now Locked On is pitching 360 media campaigns that have audio, video, social, CTV. I got like this close to producing a TV commercial. So I think that is the future of podcasters and kind of these niche sports media networks, is not living in one place anymore and being able to offer brand partners, full funnel activation. And I think that's just what we're going to need to do. That's what everyone's going to need to do, not just in sports.
Yeah.
Right. Like you look at Alex Cooper and Call Her Daddy, like, in the brand that she's built around that herself as a personality in the podcast space is super unique. And I really believe that that's the future.
Right. Well, and as you mentioned with Alex Cooper, she's got like a drink now, and so I feel like these kind of what started out as podcasting, like we mentioned, there's going out with merch, products, kind of building it out into a full scale company, I guess you could say it, right? That offers more than just podcasting. But I wanted to dive in a little bit. We didn't really talk about this before, but ESPN just came out with a new app, right? That's coming out in the fall, and I was curious what your thoughts are. As you mentioned, the kind of like the legacy media, and they used to do it this way and that way, and then now it's kind of changing where there's 22 different streaming services if you want to watch the NFL or whatever. You got everything. Do you think it's possible that we kind of scale it back, pull the reins and say, okay, we're going to work with these 4 kind of channels or what have you, like restart basically? Because I feel like there's way too many streaming services offering games.
Yeah, I mean, history repeats itself. Consolidation is inevitable, right? We saw all of the fragmentation come into play, and all of these different, think about all of the different podcasts, like individual networks that were in play, and then the consolidation that took place, I think predominantly about 5 years ago, when Spotify was just gobbling up everything that they could, right? And consolidating that distribution. When it comes to like the ESPN's newly launched app, I think like the horse has left the stable a little bit in that regard. It's too valuable to the leagues and for those legacy media networks to control it, right? You think about NFL Plus or NBA League Pass, like that's direct revenue streams to the leagues that they don't have to share with broadcast companies in the same way that they used to. So I can't imagine them going backwards in any way like that. And then there's alternate broadcasts as well. Like, Locked On has our OTT product. FanDuel has FanDuel TV that surrounds all of their betting and everything like that. So I think it's a catch-22 for both the distributor and the consumer, right? As the consumer, man, I just want to watch the NFL games.
Exactly.
I just want all access to the NFL games, And so it's like, now what am I buying? I have kids. Am I just going to buy that ESPN bundle that's now Disney Plus and
right.
and Nat Geo and everything? I swear my streaming subscriptions now add up to more than the cable I cut
exactly
years ago. So it's hard to say exactly where it'll go. I don't think that the leagues are going to pull back from putting more money in their own pockets.
Yeah, they've seen all the checks. They're not going back now. They're never doing that.
No way.
And speaking to kind of the checks and the money side of it, with partnerships being a big role, and kind of the media side of sports, and I guess just business. On your side of things, when you're looking to make good partnerships to connect with the right brands or companies, what does that look like in 2025? changed over the years since you've been in the industry, or kind of what's that looking like?
Yeah, I honestly think it's the same, whether it's sports or comedy or news,
Mm.
whether it's 2025 or 2015. Contextual alignment and sticky creative. It's just, that's always been one of the most important things. I think really good creative has been the backbone of great advertising for years. And it has to make sense to the consumer, and it has to be memorable. A lot of our clients that are our biggest sponsors and are most successful, they have the best contextual alignment, like a
Yeah.
FanDuel or a Game Time, but then we see the success when we drill down a little bit more into super specific sports products meeting our diehard sports fan base. NFL Game Pass, or I've seen campaigns for both Sling TV,
Yeah.
like generic streaming, and then NBA Game Pass, and the success we saw on conversion specifically for an NBA Game Pass versus just a Sling TV was just incomparable. It was just so much higher for an NBA Game Pass. And keeping the creative sticky is super important. I mean, we've done some cool things. State Farm has been our exclusive insurance provider on the NBA network for a few years now. We recently did something with them where we had Jake Madison from Locked On Pelicans
Yep.
beat Jake from Locked On,
Yeah, yeah,
versus
yeah,
the
yeah.
traditional Jake from State
That's
Farm. You
good.
think about what State Farm did with Chris Paul, with
Hmm.
the Cliff Paul campaigns that they did for a couple of years, extending humor
Hmm.
into a traditionally like pretty serious topic. Beyond that, a partner, our auto partner Nissan, they've been our main March Madness sponsor, our exclusive auto partner for the last few years, and we see similar results when it comes to traditional creative versus really sticky creative. So we've done, we recently did a study with them, and in looking at their custom or looking at their traditional spot versus our custom March Madness spot that aligned the messaging around the Nissan Armada to the biggest moments in March Madness tournament. That custom creative spot drove a 480% higher lift in aided brand awareness than their traditional spot. So it's a massive difference in terms of like how memorable this spot is, how its contextual alignment, and how a listener or a fan really engages with that spot and remembers it. And so I think that these are all super important things. It hasn't changed, but the fragmentation in digital media has required them to drill down a little bit more. Again, we talked about legacy media, and that legacy media, when the NBA game, when NFL game was broadcast, like you had one spot,
Yeah.
that you would
Couldn't
produce,
miss. Yeah.
and that was a mass reach creative that focused on that mass reach delivery. And today it's a lot more hyper focused. The message on Locked On with Jake from Locked On is going to be different from the message that they have either in traditional television or in other podcasting. And I think that fragmentation in creative, along with the distribution, is super important. And brands need to align themselves with the networks that help them kind of guide them towards making those better choices, so their message gets through.
Yeah. And right, the message I feel like is obviously kind of the storytelling part of it and making sure it connects with the fans and kind of a local and I guess regional or obviously national, but that kind of brings me to kind of the value of the local and the daily podcast content and the shows. And so as Locked On's kind of branched out with, all the different shows and podcasts, can maybe like speak to kind of the value of the local and the daily podcast, specifically creating the content, as you mentioned, making it more specific to that region, and then obviously kind of how that unfolds.
Yeah, of course. Locked On's mantra has always been local passion at national scale. We deliver this perfect mix of a local voice with daily relevance and national reach, all in this high attention, brand safe environment. It's not just content, it's
Yeah.
community that we're building. It's consistency, it's conversion at scale. So Locked On, we have a podcast for every team produced every day across the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, and college sports, right? We're producing hundreds of shows every day. But we know that sports fandom is deeply local, right? Yeah. Fans follow their team. Like, I'm a diehard Kings fan. I have been since early days. I grew up in sports radio here in Sacramento, going to the Kings game, and with Mike Bibby and Chris Webber back when we were great. And my fandom lies with the Kings, not the NBA. I don't want to just watch ESPN all day and get all these updates. I really just care about what's going on with the Kings. And so that's where Locked On has built this national footprint with local intimacy in a way that no other sports network has been able to deliver. And that's just a huge difference from what we've done. And it's really interesting to see this evolution, right? Because ESPN and The Athletic nearly simultaneously announced that they were pulling back from local coverage. Maybe it was about a year or two ago that they decided that they announced that. And, we saw this as an opportunity. They're pulling away from giving fans what they actually want in order to fit the model of the network, not the model of the fan. The model of the fan is, I want on-demand content for my team, and I want it where I want it. So that's why Locked On is distributed on audio. Maybe you listen on a Spotify or Apple, but maybe you're watching on YouTube, or I know folks that watch it on OTT. Like, they have their shows ready, queued up on their TV, and so it's about meeting the fan where they are and giving them the content that exactly they need, and giving them that daily cadence, hyper relevant, real-time content. Our Locked On Mavericks host was one of the first people to post a reaction video to the Luka trade. And he gained thousands of new followers in that moment. And I'm pretty sure he just did it again with the ridiculous,
like 1.8% chance or whatever.
Less than 1% chance to get Cooper, and it's, you put on the tinfoil hat, right?
Exactly.
They traded Luka and now they got Cooper. So it's, our hosts are trusted influencers in the local market, but our product is built to be scaled at a national level for our ad partners. So we're doing two things. We're providing the fan what they want on the local level, but we're giving our advertisers this national footprint that allows them to activate at scale while speaking to these micro communities of fans on a team by team basis.
Yeah, well, and it's a perfect business model obviously there, and it's working out well. But the part I love the most is kind of that local kind of community. And I feel like Americans we move transient, right? We're from all over, but you can still have where you grew up as a kid, right? So like you, for example, are Kings, but like you're gonna live back east, you're still dialed into the Locked On Kings and all that thing. So I think that's kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So I'm glad you kind of brought that up. Is the fandom starts out a lot of times is when you're a kid, and then your parents move, whatever. But kind of coming back to that, and I feel like that's all people want. Like, in my opinion, you don't
lose your
exactly.
fandom, right?
Yep.
I lived in New York City for 10 years. Like, I didn't become a Knicks fan. It would be easier to be a Knicks fan right now,
I'm sure,
than it would be to be a Kings fan. But that's it. Your fandom is deeply embedded in you. I remember seeing a post that said something about you become a fan with around 10 years old or something like that. And that stays with you for your whole life.
Right. It's I saw someone once say, guys will meet their best friend at 9 years old and their favorite team at 9 years old, never change. And
exactly.
That's so true.
100%. And that's where Locked On comes in, right? Because as a Kings fan living in New York, where am I getting my content for the Kings? How do I stay up to speed and be the expert, and so that's where Locked On comes in, and it's kind of part of the whole process as well. Is like being free, being accessible. Try finding content on the Boston Celtics right now that's not behind a paywall.
Yeah.
And Locked On really, it's deeply embedded in our ethos to be, you know, there for the fan when and where they need us.
Mhm. Yeah, no, wonderful. And I love that and the kind of the brand mission. And we talked a little bit about the sales and the media, kind of as far as the brand goes or the ads and working with the local, but kind of making that national reach. And a lot of the listeners for this podcast are younger kind of sports professionals and whatnot. And so for someone looking to kind of break into the sports media sales kind of role career, what's, a piece of advice or something that you would give them?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of different avenues that people can take. I I I don't think that there's one size fits all anymore. I remember I'm thinking of an example of a young man who wanted to get into sports media, and he just started building like social clips. He put together like a sizzle reel for the Dolphins or someone.
Yeah.
I remember he just like asked to come on the field one day and was gonna like shoot a free video, and it was amazing. And he got the opportunity to be the social media manager for the Dolphins or whatever team it was. Being creative, thinking outside the box and like how to engage with sports. I got a little lucky. I'm not going to lie. I've always wanted to be in sports. I started, my father was the general manager of the sports radio station here in Sacramento. I started recording spots for sports radio when I was 6 years old. So like, this has been always kind of what I wanted to do. And, it was a long journey to kind of get to this point, right?
Yeah.
I went into local radio, and selling, at CBS at the time. And we had 10-10 wins. And, I was selling Fresh 102.7, which is like a hot AC. I kept like trying to sell the fan. I wasn't supposed to, but I kept trying to, and kept pushing it. And then, I went into national radio, and within national radio, there were sports properties that I was selling, sports radio stations for Cumulus that I was selling across the country, and then got into Westwood One national and was helping sell the Westwood One podcast network out of New York. And we had Ben Shapiro and some really great names, but we also had Pat McAfee and some solid sports products, and I always just leaned into it. All you can do is like kind of follow the path that you're given, but always like find ways to like lean into what you want to be doing. And ultimately that opened the door for me with Locked On early on when I connected with our founder, David Locke. And if you're passionate, you innovate, and you just stay true to who you are, I think you just keep it out in the universe. It might not happen overnight. I talk to a lot of folks that are like looking for instant gratification, and I think that that's the world that we live. Like they graduate and they think that they should immediately have a job like in sports media making six figures, and that's just not how it works. But more than 10 years later, like through my career, I'm specifically in sports media, and so the path isn't always straight.
Yeah.
But if you that's what you really want to do, you'll get there.
Mhm. Well said. And I love the passion aspect of it and kind of finding that and then leaning into it, whatever it may be, right? Doesn't have to be, I guess, in sports. And I've talked to a number of people who, grew up and they're like, oh, I want to work in sports. And then they get in sports and they're like, maybe not. And then they go. But you got to figure that out, right? And
sure.
I feel like you can't, that there's only experience is kind of the best way to figure that out and speak and relating to the industry, kind of before we wrap up here, what's one, maybe a media trend, podcast trend that you're bullish on, that others are potentially sleeping on?
Again, I think it ties into a couple of things of what we've talked about, right? Is like this full funnel media strategy is like not just being one place.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to a friend of mine who she's over at a major network, not sports, but we were talking about growth, and I asked, are any of your shows on YouTube? And none of them were on YouTube yet.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising.
And that was super surprising. And that's where like half of our audience is now. And, I think that that's where the growth is continuing to be. I think platform native monetization like YouTube Shorts
Mhm.
is super important now. We think about what TikTok has done
Yeah.
in changing consumer behavior to uh, be more preferable towards like short form content and that kind of bite-sized information. And
Yeah.
that's where Locked On is has pushed ourselves into shorts and TikTok and everything like that. And again, that's all part of the full funnel monetization. I think AI is playing a role, in improving execution, improving data, and all around workflow and discoverability. The people that are taking advantage of it, I think, are going to get ahead more quickly, and those
Yeah.
that aren't, whether it's the distribution or AI or just whatever, those innovations, right? Programmatic was pretty hot for a second. It still is, but it was, about 2 years ago, it was like the only thing people were talking about. And we were ahead of that conversation. You have to, like, when you hear about the innovation, taking advantage of it early and often.
Mhm.
We've heard about, being on YouTube like the very beginning of 2021, and it wasn't widely adopted yet.
Mhm.
So we were kind of very, very quick to jump on that. And now we get half of our audience from YouTube. That's been our biggest growth vehicle. So I think hearing about those innovations, it's like buying Bitcoin when you heard about it the first time.
Yeah.
If
Like, I
only
don't know
you
what's
had
going
jumped
on,
on
but
it when you heard about it the first time. You have to test, you have to innovate, you have to figure out what's working, what's not working. And if you just kind of sit by and like let the industry grow around you, you're gonna miss it, and then it's gonna be too late.
right. Well, and the industry won't stop, right? Kind of what you're saying is like if you're not growing and innovating, like everyone else will, and your company or brand or whatever you have won't necessarily. So that's
Yeah, you're gonna be
says
gated.
yeah, exactly. And especially in I love the bite size analogy made in the sports industry. I mean, especially media side, especially is rolling, and you're behind with the bite size media clips or whatnot, then it'll leave you in the dust. But that was well said as you kind of close it out there. And for the listeners and followers, where can they find yourself, Locked On, maybe your favorite Locked On show, kind of all that good stuff?
You can find us anywhere. Again, meeting the fan where they want. Whether it's an audio channel like Spotify or Apple. YouTube is a great place. You can follow us on your socials: Instagram, X, TikTok. And now OTT. If you're in a major market like LA, check out our Fast TV channels. We're live. You can turn us on for a 24/7 TV channel. Just have all your local LA sports right there. And you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to connect at any time. So, yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll make sure to share that out and keep everyone up to date on Locked On and obviously what you guys are doing over there. And appreciate you coming on today, Brian. And I guess any last words, we'll leave you with the mic here to close it out.
Oh, no pressure. No, I mean, I think that it's exciting. It's exciting to be in the sports landscape. It's exciting. It's exciting to still be in the podcast space. It's not often, and I said this when I really got into the podcast space early on. It's not often that we get to reinvent the wheel. Like there's new media channels only come along so often. It was radio, it was TV, it's print.
Yeah.
Social came onto the scene, and that was really big. And to think about, again, I come from legacy radio. I got to be a part of kind of this digital evolution in the sports radio space. That's super exciting. And as we continue to grow, I'm just eager to see what Locked On grows into. We're certainly more than just a podcast network these days. And, I'm excited to just see how the industry continues to grow, what other podcasters continue to do, and how Locked On can continue to deliver great content for diehard sports fans.
Yep. Yeah, and I you got a fan in me, obviously, with the we don't have a basketball team in San Diego, but we do have or an NFL team. So we do have the Padres. So
Yeah,
appreciate
they
the boys
bailed
down
on you.
there.
The Chargers bailed on you.
Yeah,
But hey, if you're living in San Diego and you're still a Chargers fan, go listen to Locked On Chargers.
e-
It's still there,
exactly.
and that's how you can find it. So
Exactly. No, that's what I was alluding to a little bit is I appreciate them still holding tight and holding true to the San Diego Chargers and kind of what they're about. You
yeah,
have a fan of me if they ever come back. But yeah, appreciate it. And thanks again, Brian, for joining us today and the listeners and viewers for checking us out. And we'll see you guys next week.
awesome. Thanks, Connor.
You bet.